The United Monarchy, like I said, it might take us a while to figure out why it's called the United Monarchy, because it certainly doesn't sound very united at first at all. Especially not the story on the ground, we'll say. Especially not looking simply at the political story. It doesn't seem very united at all. Well, Samuel goes to a young man named Saul. And now this is very important to the story. Samuel takes a little bit of olive oil with him, and he says to Saul, "Saul, you are anointed king." And he takes the olive oil, and he pours just that little bit of olive oil, maybe a tablespoon, over the head of Saul, and says, "You are anointed king." You see, that's the same ritual that had developed for the judges, and now it's being applied to the new king. The same vocabulary of anointing, being chosen by God, the same symbol, the application of olive oil, the same language, the same vocabulary, the same ritual is now transferred from the judges to the king. That's going to be significant later. But then Samuel goes to another young man, a young man named David, and says, "No, wait a minute, you're anointed king." He takes a little bit of olive oil and he applies it to David's head. Well, on the ground, you have two different men making the same claim to being king. They've both been anointed by the same person, Samuel, who's used the same wording, the same ritual. They're eyewitnesses and so on. And so it doesn't look very united at all. The writer of the story, though, tells us something which is significant on two different levels, or in two different ways. What the writer says is significant. Saul has done something. He's really messed up. He's really messed up. And God has rejected Saul from being king. On the ground, what we see is a civil war. A civil war being fought by two armies. One army loyal to Saul, the other army loyal to David. Behind the scenes, though, the writer tells us that God has rejected Saul from being king. There's more to the story, you see, than just what we see in the political events on the ground. That's part of the point of the story here. Another point is that the same rules apply to Saul, even though he's king. Just because he's king, he's not exempt from the rules. When Saul breaks the rules, the same rules apply to Saul that apply to everybody else. Nobody is above the law. That's an important principle, an important concept, and one that I'll be coming back and saying some things about later in talking and evaluating the Hebrew legacy. But as far as the story on the ground goes, you have a civil war. You have two men making the same claim to being king. They both have the same experience of the same man, Samuel, coming, saying the same words, applying the olive oil in the same way, and so on. It's a civil war that lasts for about 7 years, but eventually David wins and becomes the new king, and in a lot of ways the first undisputed king of this new country. The first undisputed king of this new country. Well, if now you have a king and a new country, well then you need to have a name for your country. I mean, how embarrassing would that be? To fight a civil war for 7 years over who's going to be the king and still not have a name for your country. They have to come up with a name for their country. For a name for their country, these people go way back in the story they tell about themselves. Way back in the story they tell about their ancestors, all the way back to the man they call their third patriarch. In this course so far, I've mentioned the first patriarch, Abraham. Abraham's son, Isaac, is the second patriarch. And now they go back to a story about Abraham's grandson, a story about a man named Jacob. It's an interesting story. It's an interesting story in that the story provides the name for this new nation. And I want to tell you that story.